Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Her Faith Inspires podcast, where we take cultural issues and we tackle them with biblical truth. I have an episode for you today that I think is burning inside my heart, and I'm eager and excited to share it with you. I believe this episode is probably going to be one of my favorites and maybe even one of your favorites, because you're going to hopefully be as fired up as I am when it's all said and done. Before I talk to you about being the one, I have a few announcements for you. I'm going to get through them fast, so you guys don't have to be like, oh my gosh. But Let's Get Real begins this Monday, February 6th. So if you're listening to this the week of February 6th, you want to get your child signed up now, because we're starting. And then I have one of my favorite long sleeve t-shirts in the shop, and the brand is Comfort Colors, and it says "Be Salty, Stay Lit." The verse is on the sleeve, and it's white with black embroidered letters. After the month of February, that shirt is going out of the shop, and it won't be seen again until maybe next year. We'll see. Also, the Emotionalism Junkie survey is launching the first weekend in March, and I'll be making it available online and at the women's conference I'll be speaking at in Charlotte, North Carolina, the first weekend in March. So keep an ear out for that when that drops, because it's going to be available on the website. For those of you who love the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and or review. It really helps get the podcast into the earbuds of others. And then for those of you who want behind the scenes content and information and all the VIP stuff, find me on Patreon at Shanda Fulbright. For $5 a month, you get lots of perks, book clubs, free devotionals, live Zooms, discounts, and all of that. And actually, I give a $5 discount to those in my VIP membership for the shirt. So you're already getting a discount on the shirt the first month that you're in, if you're doing that in the month of February. So, all right, now that the announcements are out of the way, here is the order of our episode today. What is the difference between the crowd or following the crowd and the one who chooses to break away from the crowd? We're going to look at examples from this from scripture, and I'm going to talk to you about the crowd itself, how in the Bible we see it as a character of itself. Like we see Peter, James, John, Jesus, those are all characters, people that are in the New Testament, but the crowd is also a character. Why is that? Secondly, let's evaluate when one person decides to stand up for truth in this culture, like in real life, with real life examples. How does that make a difference? Does it make a difference? Let's look at some real life examples of that. And then what is the call to action at the end of this episode? So when it's over, we don't just be like, that was a really nice episode, and we move on. What do we do now? So to get started, you may have heard, if you're paying attention to what's in the news, and some of you might be like, I don't even watch the news anymore, I'm over it. I don't watch the news either. I listen to the news because I can't get my news from certain sources. So I said I listen to the news. I read the news. I don't watch it. I read it. So there is a real life story that just happened that made me want to talk about this. It really got me thinking about this. And I've been wanting to talk about this for a while. And then Ivan Provorov, a hockey player that refused to wear a pride themed jersey and like go out with a hockey stick with rainbow colors on it. He refused to do that. He was ridiculed for it and bashed by the media. Like, that's not a surprise, right? That he would be bashed by the media, but I'm talking like people were saying, go back to your own country. He didn't back down. People in the media have said some terrible things about him, like I said, and in the NHL, each team has about like a minimum of 20 players or a maximum of 23 players at one time on the roster, which they probably have more, on the sideline that's not on the roster to play. But let's just take the 23. There are more than 31 teams with at least 23 players on the roster. And that means that there were about 620 to 713 hockey players in the NHL. Ivan Provorov is the only one that I know of who plays, hockey for the NHL. I don't know anybody else who plays hockey for the NHL because I don't watch hockey. That's not my sport. Now, maybe you do, but I don't. And there's a reason I know who he is, because out of all of those 713 hockey players in the NHL, he's the only one who stood up and decided to do something, not to do something that he was trying to, they were pushing him to do. And so now, even if you don't watch hockey, you know his name. And most people in America who are paying attention to the culture war happening right now know his name, regardless of whether or not they're hockey fans or sports fans. So we're going to get into other real life examples soon. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about the first point, and that means we're going to go to scripture to see what the word of God says about being the one. Okay. Are there times when it's just going to be you to have to take a stand? Sure. I mean, we probably know that, right? But there are many examples in the Bible that encourage us that we wouldn't be the only one throughout history who's been the only one to take a stand, but we might be in a certain situation, have to break free from a crowd and be the only one. So what is the difference between the crowd and the one who breaks away from the crowd? The best way, again, for me to explain this is by equating it to a Where's Waldo picture. So if you've ever seen like the Where's Waldo, it's hard to spot Waldo. He's in the middle of a picture in a scene with a bunch of people. So if you don't know, Waldo is a character. He's just got like this red and white striped shirt on. It's supposed to make it, I guess, easier for you to spot him because you know what he's wearing, red and white. But either way, he's in a painting with a lot of, or a picture with a lot of other people in it, and he's not easy to spot because he blends in with the crowd. Like there are other things that are red and white around him, and they purposely do that so he's harder to find. But regardless, he's in a crowd with a lot of people. So a crowd itself is a large number of people that's gathered together in a disorganized or unruly way. Now, not everyone who blends in with the crowd is with a disorganized group, but when we see this concept of crowd, we see a group of people that blends in together. They're all moving in the same direction. They're all, usually yelling the same things, or they're yelling and no one can understand what anyone's saying because everyone's yelling. It just sounds like a big, a chorus of voices that aren't in sync, really. So no one stands out in the crowd. It actually can bring chaos, and everyone's just stuck together, and it's really difficult to pinpoint who's in the crowd. I mean, think about it. This is not a foreign concept. In fact, we see many in the Bible who were either part of a crowd, like we see the crowd in the New Testament, or we see those that break away from the crowd. But what I really want you to keep in mind here as we move forward is that the crowd in the New Testament is a character itself. Like when there was a bunch of people around, we didn't know their names. We only knew that they were part of a crowd, that was the crowd. So you will see in the Gospels that crowds followed Jesus. You see the word crowd a lot of times. That's why it's a character in and of itself. The crowd pressed against Jesus. Like an example of that is when the woman was with the issue of blood touched his clothes, and he felt power go out from him. And when he questioned, like, who touched me? The disciples were like, what do you mean who touched you? The crowd is thronging you. And that's often wherever Jesus went, the crowd would follow. The crowd is stirred up by the religious leaders to crucify Jesus right before he gets crucified. And we just know that they riled up the crowd, and the crowds yelled, crucify him, crucify him. We don't know the difference between who was in the crowd on the day he fed the 5,000. We just know the number of the crowd, but we don't know anything specific about them. We know that they ate loaves and fish, but we also don't know the difference between who was in that crowd who ate the loaves and fish and who was in the crowd on the day that Jesus was betrayed, because in both situations, they're called the crowd. And the character is the crowd itself, meaning there probably wasn't much of a difference between the mentality of the people in each crowd, the ones who ate the loaves and fish and followed him, and the ones who yelled, crucify him, because what was their intention to follow him? If there was a difference, then I believe that there would be some sort of distinction. So please understand that the crowd is a character in the Gospels, and it wasn't until someone broke free from the crowd that they were recognized, and their situation or their names became part of the story, became known to all of us who now look back and read it, right? So here are just a few more examples from the Bible of real people in real times, in real places, who made history. Like, think about it. They broke away from the crowd, and now we're talking about them in 2023. So there are many in the Bible who took a stand apart from the crowd. And I encourage you, to go back and read these in full context, because I'm going to paraphrase a lot of them. I'm going to give you a couple of scriptures, and I'm not going to give you the entire passages. So, I want you to get the brevity of their commitment and their stance and what it could have cost them, because their lives were literally on the line in every situation. And we know how it ends as we read it. We see it unfold. They only knew in the moment by moment play out. So when we think about putting ourselves in that perspective, that would be very scary from the beginning to take the stand, not knowing how it would end. So the first example I get is of two midwives that maybe you don't hear much about, but I think that they are two characters in Exodus that are very much worth pointing out. And that's Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives who saved many babies because they wouldn't kill them on the birthing stool at the command of Pharaoh. And actually, Exodus 1:15-17 says, then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah: when you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So there we see that Shiphrah and Puah, because they feared the Lord, ended up saying and saving all the boys. They did not do what Pharaoh told them to do. If Pharaoh would have found out, they would have been dead. And if you continue to read, you'll see where, because they feared God, God blessed them with families of their own. And we see that family is a blessing here, for people who in our culture today don't think it's great to have kids. God bless them with kids, bless them with their own families. So these women took a stand because they feared God. I think that's very important to point that out. Before we talk about David, we always hear about David and Goliath. Yeah, sure, David was the only one who stood against Goliath. He was small. He was still a kid. But before we get to that, I want to talk to you about the crowd full of men in the Israelite army who stood on the sidelines for 40 days while Goliath taunted the armies of Israel and mocked them and God. Think about it. 40 days, thousands of men in the Israelite army. Not one man would go fight Goliath. Not one. And all Goliath said was, I need one guy who will take a stand, and whoever wins out of me and this one guy, then we'll either be slaves to you or you will be slaves to us. So 1 Samuel 17:24 rolls around, and David, 1 Samuel 17, I think it's in 16 and 17, if you want to read it. David shows up and he hears Goliath taunting the armies of Israel, and David takes offense to it because he's like, how dare him talk about God like that and God's people like that? And so when he stands up to go face Goliath, he says in verse 24, whenever the Israelites saw the man Goliath, this is going back to the army. Whenever the Israelites saw the man Goliath, they all fled from him in great fear. These men were trained men who fought in battles, and not one out of the thousands of men on the sidelines would go fight Goliath. In fact, they ran the other way. They turned around and ran the other direction. But we don't know anyone in that crowd of men. We don't know who their names were or what their names were, who they are. We don't know their stories. It took the courage of a shepherd boy, because that's all David was at the time, was a shepherd boy who respected God and had his own relationship with him, to take a stand. And in 1745, this is what David says to Goliath: you come against me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. So, here's the thing. There's a lot more context to this, but both David and the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, had something in common here. They all feared God. They didn't take a stand to make a name for themselves. They did it because they feared God and not man. So when I say that now I know, Ivan Provorov's name, that's not our motivation to take a stand for the truth. The motivation is because Ivan had convictions, and he said, I'm not going to compromise my convictions because you want me to wear a jersey with the rainbow flag and hit a hockey stick with the rainbow taped to it. No, you do you and I'll do me. And here we have the same example with David and Shiphrah and Puah saying, no, we fear God. We won't do what you're asking us to do. It goes against our convictions of serving God. And another example is Esther. Love the story of Esther. I think that there is a more prominent verse in Esther besides for such a time as this. And I posted about it a couple of times, but I'm also going to talk about it right now. Esther became the queen of Persia and the wife of Artaxerxes. I think Esther is an easy read if you just wanted to go read the whole book. Haman was going to kill all the Jews, and Esther was worried because, her uncle came to her and said, you're going to have to go plead on behalf of the Jews. And she couldn't just go in and talk to the king without being summoned. She had to be summoned by him. It wasn't just like, yeah, sure, I'll go talk to my husband. And she didn't want to do it. Her initial reaction wasn't like, okay, yes, I'll do this. So you can see the Bible. I think the author of Esther does a really great job of pinpointing her inner struggle, because these things are not easy. It's not easy to take a stand. It's not easy to break away from the crowd. It's easier to just go by the rules of what Esther was required to do to keep the status quo in the kingdom, right? But we see this inner struggle, especially because she asked her uncle and all the people to fast for her. Fast for me for a few days. Because again, taking a stand isn't easy, especially when the stakes are high. And again, in this case, the stake was her life. She could lose her life. She was married to the one who could make that call. So I see a lot of people when they talk about Esther, and they talk about when her uncle tells her, like, who knows if God didn't bring you to the palace for such a time as this. And that is such a popular verse. For such a time as this, you'll all have your for such a time as this moment. Women's ministries do it. But is that the heaviest verse? Is that the most important verse? I think there's another verse that's dependent upon your for such a time as this. Okay? Because people who quote this often try to encourage people to take a stand, or they're saying you have a purpose. It's a great purpose. It's a for such a time as this. But her for such a time as this moment could have cost her life. And I don't think that that's what people mean when they say this. But her words are really the response we should all have when we take a stand for the Lord. And once, Mordecai told her for such a time as this, she said, I will go to the king then. And if I perish, I perish. Those are really hard words to say. Yeah, I'll go to the king. I'll put my life on the line. And if I end up dying, then it is what it is. We all have to risk that for such a time as this moment, because otherwise the moment passes us by and we don't have, if we're going to sit there and wonder how it's all going to play out before we take the stand, the moment passed, it's over. If Esther would have allowed that moment to pass and not stand up for others, we wouldn't know her name. There wouldn't be a book in the Bible named after her. But that's not why she stood up for all the Jews in her day. She didn't know we were going to be reading a book called Esther. She did it because it was the right thing to do, not knowing whether she would live or die. Her response is the same response we should all have when we stand against the status quo and go against the crowd. If we lose our reputation, our jobs, our friends, our contracts, our followers, fill in the blank. If I perish, I perish, but I'm going to stand for the truth. We must determine to stand for the truth before we get to that point, even if we're the only one standing. And in reality, Esther was the only one who could do what she did. There was nobody else who could have gone to the king. She's the only one who could have done that. So our last example, and there are many, but our last example is of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, three Hebrew boys. I'm sure you've heard plenty about them in the book of Daniel. They wouldn't bow to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, and there were thousands of others who did. I always picture that moment when the harps and all of this, the musicians play their music. That is the signal for everybody fall on your faces before the statue, and you have this sea of men just all laying prostrate on the ground, and then you see three Hebrew boys standing up, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They would definitely be standing out in that scenario. But we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we know their names. We don't know the names of the others who fell down at the sound of the music to bow. We don't know who their families were or anything about them. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, before they were being taken away to the fiery furnace, they said, even if God does not deliver us, we're not going to bow. I mean, they had already determined, we know God can deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we won't bow because he's going to deliver us from your hand. So, Daniel 3:17-18 specifically says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So it's very sobering. Like, we have to understand they didn't go against the king's decree because they thought they would benefit from it. In every situation, there was danger. There was a threat. Every situation, a threat to life. And these men went against the king's decree because only God was worthy of their worship. Even if God did not save them from the fiery furnace, they knew they would be with him after their death. So they stood out from the crowd, literally stood out from the crowd. And again, there are many examples in the Bible that we can use. What I want you to understand is that we are not David. We're not Esther. We're not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those aren't our stories. Those are descriptive stories to let us know, to encourage us that when we do, whatever the outcome might be, our faithfulness to God does not go unnoticed, and it will give courage to others. We should be inspired by their stories of courage, because their stories of courage are going to make us say it's worth standing out. It's their stories of bravery help us remember that why they took a stand, because they feared God and not man, we can too. They knew the truth mattered more than anything they could lose in this life. And we have to come to that point of decision making as well. And that's something to wrestle through now. So if, God forbid, we ever have to face that and stand up for the truth in some way, that there's a risk, of loss in some way, a job, like I said, or whatever it may be that would hurt and sting and be hard, that we understand God's going to take care of us. God will take care of us. That's the whole point. So another thing is, we can look at the contrast of this. It doesn't always end with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into a fiery furnace and being protected and then coming out. Doesn't always end with Esther going in when she wasn't called and coming out unscathed. It doesn't always end with David fighting Goliath and him prevailing. Sometimes it ends like John the Baptist, with your head on a platter for taking a stance. And sometimes it ends like David. The point, we don't know the outcome. We don't know the end. That's the scary part. It might cost us, it might not. But the point is that we should stand because we fear God and not man. And again, I'm not saying something that's easy, or that I don't have to wrestle through at times myself. I am not telling you that. I'm saying that we have to be aware of this, because if it ever happens to where we're in those situations, we want to be praying through that now and asking God for the strength. So I want to take a look at some real life examples of people who stand for the truth in our current culture. And it's only a couple, and I know you've probably heard of some of these, but again, they're worth talking about because these people are brave and they're standing against a hostile culture in America, where I don't believe in the past we've had to justify or explain ourselves or our beliefs like we have to do today. So I want to preface this with something I think is worth noting, though, something I read in George Barna's American Worldview Inventory, that this can go both ways. You can take a stand for something that's not the truth, that you think is the truth, for something that you think is a notable cause, but it doesn't mean that it is. We see people doing that today. We see that for other organizations in the past couple of years. So oftentimes we think small numbers can't make a big difference. I used to think if you can rally the troops, they talk about the silent majority. So the majority is going to make the difference when the majority shows up. Well, yeah, when you're voting on something, you do need a majority. But if you want to make a change, you don't. We often think small numbers can't make a big difference, and that's not true. It's just that most people want to be accepted, so they don't go against the majority. They stick with the majority. And what's the majority? The crowd. Most of the people. So I'm going to give you an example. It's not a good example, but I'm going to give you a real life example that can show you this can go the opposite direction. It's a small group that ended up making a big change. And I'm just going to read it straight from George Barna's book. And he said about how only 3% of the population ended up changing the entire course of the nation. Now think about it. 3% of the population ended up changing the entire course of the nation. And his quote is, "Consider the experience of the LGBTQ community. Its well-conceived and meticulously executed long-term plan for growth smoothed the way for radical changes in the law and in the way the Americans think about gender identity and sexual orientation. They accomplished their goals despite being less than 3% of the population. Movements that are small in the number of passionate supporters, but are well-funded, highly disciplined, and adroitly execute strategic plans can transform the larger culture despite their tiny size." Okay. So again, this isn't the example. It's like getting you fired up to go make a change to stand for truth. It's showing you that you don't need big, like quantities of people to be on your side to make a change. Small can, but we also have to remember this goes both ways. LGBTQ community changed the course of the nation. They started doing it in the 1980s. I believe Bodie Baucham has a really great example of this on one of his sermons. I'll have to try to find it. And if I do, I'll link it in the show notes. But he talks about how they would get together, just a few of them at a round table, and strategically talk about propaganda, and he calls it conforming, desensitizing, conforming, and jamming. And so they began to put homosexuals in these really cool characters on different TV shows, and they would come out with the homosexual star athletes would come out and say that they were gay, and became more and more widely accepted by the population until now you have where we are with the transgender issue. Okay. So again, that is to show you that you don't need a lot of people to make a difference. In fact, you only need one. Okay. One. And that's the whole point of this podcast episode. Before I talk to you about the people in our current culture who have stood up for the truth in the last few months, I want to let you know this goes both ways again. Okay. Keep that in mind. If we stand up and do nothing, the deception takes over, because you don't have to be large in number or rally the troops to make a difference. So the first person we're going to talk about is Candace Cameron Bure. I believe I've talked about her before. She's a well-known actress who started as a child actor on Full House. Her brother is Kirk Cameron. He's very well known in the Christian community. He used to be on Growing Pains, I believe. I used to love that show, and I used to love Kirk Cameron. Okay, that just goes to show how old I am. Kirk Cameron was a really cool child actor as well, and he got saved and went totally more of a Jesus filmmaking route and stuff like that. Books, I think it was the Left Behind series, something to that effect. I'm not 100% sure of the details, but she is his sister, and she was on the Hallmark Channel for years as a successful actress. She recently did an interview after switching to the TV network called Great American Family, and she said in one of her interviews that somebody asked her about what kind of shows they were doing on Great American Family. And she said she believes that Great American Family will stick to storylines with traditional marriage at the forefront. All you know what broke loose. And she had to give a statement to follow her remarks, as many Hollywood actors and blue checkmark people called her a bigot and a hater. I mean, I saw some of the things that they said about her, and they roasted her and just crucified her. Hollywood actors and actresses berated her for it. However, when she did do her follow-up statement, she thankfully never retracted her initial statement about traditional marriage. That's what she believes in. She stood firm, and she said she loves everyone. No matter what, this is my view on traditional marriage. And she didn't back down from it. And I always wonder how things like this will play out. Okay, so now it happens. Great American Family starting. Now what? Is Great American Family going to tank? Is Hallmark never going to have Candace Cameron back? Well, fast forward a few weeks, and Great American Family has surpassed Hallmark in December's top charts and network views, because there are a lot of Americans who don't want to watch the stuff. Hallmark has made a total shift the last couple of years. It has started to show more homosexual relationships and things like that. People watch Hallmark for the romance of a male and female romance. That's their audience that they've had for years. That's what they've attracted over the years. Remember I said, whatever you win them with, you win them too, but they have to go with the times, or so they say, and they want to cram this stuff down people's throats. And people are like, hey, we want our traditional shows back. That's one of the reasons why I personally like to watch Hallmark. Now, the population, where the majority does show what they want, they switched to Great American Family, and the ratings went up in December. By now, people should know where Candace stands. I mean, if you know Candace Cameron Bure, she's been very consistent, and she's very bold, and she says what she believes. She has her own Instagram page. I mean, she's not keeping a secret that she's a Christian. She believes in traditional marriage. She loves her husband. They've been married for years. She doesn't back down from her beliefs. And we have to admire her for that and support her. But I don't know why people would ask her weird questions. It'd be like, what do you think about traditional marriage and gay marriage? When you know what she thinks. It's like asking the guy, who owns Chick-fil-A, why do you guys not work on Sundays? Because we're Christians. Like, come on, you know these things. You're just trying to start trouble. But I did send Candace a message on Instagram to thank her for her stance. I don't know if she saw it. I mean, probably not. I didn't go back and look. I just sent it to her just saying, thanks for standing up and not backing down once you felt the heat. Because they're in tough situations when, position where she's getting these movie deals and whatever, and they're really in the spotlight with all these followers. That's pressure. Okay, that is pressure. So I want to go back to the other person I want to highlight, and he's the one I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. It's Ivan Provorov. And I got this from an article from Fox News. I will be giving you other news articles. It was just the first one that came up. Again, I don't watch the news. I do read it from my own source. So you can get the links in the show notes. But this is what they said. Philadelphia Flyers defenseman Ivan Provorov faced backlash for his decision to boycott the organization's Pride Night to support the LGBTQ plus community. Provorov didn't participate in pregame warmups when the team wore Pride-themed jerseys and used sticks wrapped in rainbow Pride tape. He cited his Russian Orthodox religion as the reason why he didn't participate. He eventually played in the game against the Anaheim Ducks. This is what Ivan said. I respect everybody and I respect everybody's choices. He told reporters after the game, my choice is to stay true to myself and my religion. That's all I'm going to say. I think they asked him about a follow-up question, and he said, did you not hear what I just said? This is my choice. That's all I'm going to say. So he did take a stand and he left it at that. Again, he got crucified. People were like, go back to your own country. Some blue checkmark celeb said, oh, but he doesn't respect everyone or he would have worn the jerseys. Is that true? Is that what respect is? Does it mean if I respect you, I have to do what you tell me? I have to represent what you want me to represent? Is that respect? No, respect is saying, that's your opinion. This is mine. You can have your own. I'm going to have my own. We respect each other's beliefs and we respectfully disagree. I get so tired of when people try to manipulate the situation by changing the definition of the word. That is not what respect is. Respect is saying, I'll sit on the bench while everybody else goes out and still wears their rainbow flags. The NHL didn't cancel it. I just didn't participate in it. Not to mention you still had over, however many other team members out there. Again, there was a lot more said than this, but this is just, one of the things I wanted to highlight. But they all were like, go back to your own country. This is America. No, this isn't America. This is what you want America to be, but this doesn't represent all Americans. And in America, we have freedom of religion and freedom of speech. That's what America represents. If Ivan cannot express his freedom of religion, which is the reason he didn't go out there and participate, then that's not American, right? You're being actually more anti-American than him not wearing the jersey. That's my rebuttal to that. A few days later, again, I asked myself, what's going to come of this? What is NHL going to fine Ivan? Are they going to make him do this again next time? Well, a few days later, several news sources post that Ivan jersey sells out, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really cool. But the article reads, Ivan Provorov's supporters have taken to Twitter to criticize the radical woke mob for coming after him. Many praise the Flyers player for standing up for his beliefs. And the day since the Flyers Pride Night, Provorov's jersey has sold out on Fanatics and NHL Shop. This is what from the Washington Examiner. So not long after that, we have more to report here. The New York Rangers hockey team did not dress out in the rainbow colored jersey. The whole team, New York Rangers, were like, we're not going to dress out. The Daily Mail reported that the team responded by saying, in a statement to dailymail.com, the Rangers said, our organization respects the LGBTQ plus community, and we are proud to bring attention to important local community organizations as part of another great Pride Night. In keeping with our organization's core values, we support everyone's individual right to respectfully express their beliefs. I was very shocked when I heard that the whole Rangers team didn't go out. Again, you might be an NHL fan and you've heard of Ivan Provorov, but many of us have not. But now we do. We do because he took a stand against the cultural narrative and he got berated for it by some. But others supported him and some also followed his lead, like the whole team, the New York Rangers hockey team. Now, I don't know that the New York Rangers hockey team would have declined to wear the rainbow jersey if Ivan didn't. Maybe they would have. Maybe they wouldn't have. But I don't think the fact that he did decline to wear it hurt their confidence not to do so. I think that he made them more confident because he had already taken so many punches and so much heat that by the time it got to them, they were just following his lead. Now, what can you say to that though? When one man does it, he inspires others, and then you're like, okay, maybe not everyone in America is for this. And it just emboldens those to speak up and to make their voices heard. In this day and age, the culture is the crowd. The culture is the crowd. And they were the crowd in the first century. The crowd has never changed. They're always the ones with the loudest voice. They're always the ones who are a little confused and not sure where they stand because they're too busy trying to figure out where they fit. The crowd is the one who doesn't know where they stand because they're too busy trying to fit in with everyone else. And that's why the crowd is confused and lost. They don't know. They will cancel you if you don't go along with what they want. And they all just sway and move to the rhythm of the culture together. They didn't want Candace to act anymore. They didn't want Ivan to play the game anymore. If he didn't put on his jersey, they wanted him to follow what they said. They would have canceled them if they could. And that's what's next if we do not stand up and speak up on behalf of doing the right thing. We live in a place where there is freedom of speech and freedom of religion. This should not be debated. This should not be debated on whether or not someone wears a jersey or doesn't or chooses not to. If someone has any religious belief and opts out of participating in an event because of it, then they should get to do that. I mean, I had kids opting out of Christmas parties because that was against their religious beliefs. Okay, we all have beliefs. Everyone does. What makes the celebrities who agree with the LGBTQ community, their beliefs more valid than Candace's? What makes their beliefs more valid than Ivan's? You don't have to watch Candace's shows. You don't have to. You don't have to watch Ivan play hockey. You don't have to buy Ivan's jersey and make it sell out. That's the beauty of freedom. We get to choose what we participate in, and we get to respectfully decline what we don't want to participate in. Again, there are more examples in our culture of brave men and women taking a stand for the truth. We have college girls in women's sports standing up for women to have their own sport without the intrusion of men who say they're women, participating in the sport and then letting their junk out in the locker room for these poor girls to have to see. There are people standing up for that. There are parents challenging school boards and challenging the books that they're allowing into public school libraries that are talking to the kids about sexual things that they shouldn't be exposed to at their age. There are parents standing up for their children and pulling them out of public education and finding alternative and safe educational options for their kids. There are lots of people out there. They just don't make headline news. They just don't make headline news because we're not in a big sport for the NHL, and we're not acting in Hallmark movies or Hollywood movies. But just because they don't make the headline news doesn't mean it's not happening. God works on both the micro and the macro level. We see God work in big ways, and we see, him work in small ways. But when we see him work in big ways, we say, oh, I want to see that. I want to see the big ways. I want to see God work in the big and the miraculous. I want to see him do big things in the lives of others. And we look for those testimonies or the evidence of God moving big. But what about the micro level? What about the ways God moves when he uses ordinary people like you and me to take a stand and speak the truth? When we do that, we end up emboldening others to do the same. Those things might not make headline news, but it doesn't mean that they don't bring big change. It starts with one person being bold enough to speak the truth. And then you ask yourself, is that me? Like, am I willing to do that? Am I willing to do that, to stand up and speak the truth, not knowing the outcome, not knowing what could be lost? So here's the call to action. I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. We need all hands on deck. And I want to also make clear that I'm not saying pick a fight with everyone you see on social media spouting lies. I mean, that's just not effective. So we have to know what we're talking about, and we have to do it in a way that's winsome, okay, and not threatening. I had a conversation with someone who jumped on my Instagram page the other day, and she at first made me, I'll be honest, she made me angry because I'm like, what? But then I reeled in my frustration. The good thing about social media is you have time to think, right, before you respond, and they don't see that like look on your face. But I reeled in my frustration and took a very soft approach, keeping in mind that if I make her angry, she's going to stop talking and leave. And that's just going to be one encounter with another person who calls himself a Christian and didn't leave a good impression. So lo and behold, she ends up admitting to being an agnostic. And I got to share with her why I believe God exists with the cosmological argument. And we ended up having a good conversation and leaving by telling each other thank you and wishing each other the best. She first told me something about, the first thing that set me off was she said something about attending a luau with clowns. So it could have gotten weird if I allowed that comment to annoy me. But my point is, we got to make sure that we know why we are taking a stand, not to be right, but because we fear God. And we got to do it like Candace and Ivan did. They have an extreme amount of pressure on them to balance their beliefs with love because they're in the spotlight like we're not. So we're going to feel the pressure when those things happen. And I can't imagine feeling pressure like them. But here's the thing, God doesn't care about the crowd. I know God wants everyone to be saved. He sent Jesus to die for the world, right? The sins of the entire world, but that's not the crowd. Jesus gave us the parable of the one lost sheep. God is the God of one. And I know this is referencing a lost person that Christ goes to great lengths to save, but the point is that he is willing to leave the crowd to find the one. So when we stand alone, we do not stand alone. God is with us. He gives us strength. If Christ cared about the crowd, he wouldn't have told the many disciples he still had at the time in John 6 to eat his flesh and drink his blood, because the outcome was that they left him. He didn't care about large crowds following him. He wanted the truth and for them to hear the truth. And he always reminded them to listen to the truth. So do you know how we will be bold enough to stand up for the truth? When we fear God rather than man. When we know God is the ultimate judge and he is the only one we need to please, we will be convinced that standing for the truth matters no matter what. Everyone wants an Esther story or a David story or a Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story. But here's the thing. No one knows how the story will end, how it will play out. It might cost you everything. It might not. But one thing we know for sure is when you stand for the Lord, others will be encouraged to do the same, and you will not bow to the culture mob who just wants you to blend in with the crowd and go with status quo. We never know the names of the ones who are in the crowd, but we do know the ones who are brave enough to step away from the crowd and take a stand, even if they stand alone. I hope this encourages you to speak up and stand for the truth. If you're not sure how you would respond under that kind of pressure, I'm with you. I can only say I pray God gives me the strength to fear him over man and do the right thing. God is faithful to complete the work in us. Whatever we will face in this life, he will give us the strength to get through it and endure it and get to the other side. All we have to do, according to Ephesians 6, is stand. If you have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com, and I'll catch you on the next one.